Okay, welcome everyone to a deep dive. We're looking today at, well, a really unique source document you shared. It offers this very specific lens connecting uh, ancient esoteric traditions, things like alchemy, Kabbalah, to modern Canada, even as symbols.
That's right. And our mission today, just to be clear, is really to unpack the core ideas in this specific source. We want to understand the interpretive framework it's using, which can be, a bit complex.
And just see what kind of connections it makes.
Exactly. What insights or maybe thought-provoking links emerge. But, and this is important, we're sticking strictly to exploring the perspective presented in this one document. We're not here to validate it or debate it, just understand what it's actually saying.
Got it. So let's unpack it then. The source starts by laying some groundwork, doesn't it?
Right.
Introducing this esoteric worldview where physical reality is, well, layered on top of or maps onto the spiritual realm.
Precisely. It touches on these ideas where the material world isn't quite maybe the whole picture. It contrasts, for instance, a Gnostic view, where physical reality is seen as a kind of degradation, with a Christian perspective mentioned in the source.
Where material reality is fallen because of sin, but it's not inherently bad. The goal is more upliftment.
Right, not inherently inferior or evil, just fallen, but redeemable. And
Yeah.
the source notes this idea, this connection between physical and spiritual. It really persisted, even within Christian thought.
Yeah, it gives examples like popes using astrologers or all those attempts to find meaning in what looks random, astrology, tarot, reading tea leaves.
Haruspice even, reading entrails. And the stated purpose of these practices, at least according to the source, was to find this strand of order, like finding the logos almost, to bring meaning to everything.
Based on the idea that everything that happens could be God's will.
If you could just find that pattern, maybe you could understand things, maybe even divine the future.
Okay, but then the source offers a critique, right?
Yeah, here's where it pivots. It argues the flaw, the fundamental flaw in these specific practices, is trying to know God through, say, natural events or random chance, instead of through the established, ordained ways.
Which it connects back to the church.
Yes. Occult rites, in this particular view presented, are seen as trying to sort of shortcut or bypass those natural ordained vehicles for communing with the divine.
And this leads to how the source distinguishes miracles from magic.
It does. It says the difference isn't really in the effect, how they might seem to bend reality's rules. It's about the intent. Magic, as this source defines it, is taking something that belongs to God.
And using it for your own purposes.
Essentially, yeah, trying to use it for one's own will rather than aligning with the divine will.
Okay, that sets the stage pretty clearly. Now, the source starts bringing in specific traditions it uses for its interpretation. It kicks off with Jewish Kabbalah.
Right. Kabbalah is introduced as related to this whole esoteric worldview. The source notes its significant role in modern Jewish spiritual practice, something the author views with a certain, sense of tragedy.
And it lays out a specific Kabbalistic cosmology it draws on.
It does. It gets into the details of that cosmology.
So what's the main idea it pulls from that? For the later argument about Canada, I mean.
Well, the key concept for this source seems to be the tree of life. This structure, representing emanations of God, starting from infinite light, then a vacuum, then projected as Adam Kadmon, this primordial man figure.
And the source talks about a break, a fall.
Yes, it describes a kind of shattering or separation where the lower parts of this tree broke away from the higher one.
And this break is what the Kabbalist tries to fix with the great work.
Exactly. The source presents the goal as traversing this tree within oneself, trying to reunite with that primordial Adam Kadmon, ultimately to repair the entire universe. That's the great work. It mentions dot, too.
This sort of synthesis node, or a void.
Yeah, a node of knowledge, often seen as related to the separation, maybe a hidden path across the abyss created by it.
So it's the whole as above, so below idea again. Adam Kadmon, the big cosmic man, is mirrored in the biblical Adam Harishon, who contains all human souls.
Precisely. The source really leans into this microcosm idea. The individual person mirrors this divine structure. So perfecting yourself, harmonizing your inner tree, isn't just a personal journey.
It affects everything. Physical actions change the spiritual realm.
That's the concept presented. Your actions contribute to this universal repair, this tikkun olam. And the source notes the idea found in some traditions that Adam Harishon was originally hermaphroditic.
Which connects to that synthesis of opposites idea.
Right, it foreshadows that theme, which becomes really central later on. It seems like a natural bridge to the next tradition the source brings in, alchemy.
Makes sense. So how does alchemy fit into this interpretive framework?
Well, the source turns to alchemy, and it seems to draw on interpretations like Carl Jung's, which see alchemy not just as literal chemistry, but as studying the spirit through the metaphor of minerals.
And it focuses on those three materials: sulfur, mercury, salt.
Yes. Sulfur representing the soul, mercury as the bridge between body and soul, the spirit, and salt representing feelings, thoughts, individuation, essentially.
And the alchemical great work is creating the philosopher's stone, but it's not just some magic rock.
Right. The source is careful to clarify that. It's achieved through the process of the alchemists perfecting themselves. The stone is, in a way, both a physical result and the perfected alchemist. It's a transformation.
And the source points out it's made from sulfur and mercury, but not salt. Why is leaving salt out important here?
Well, remember, salt is linked to individuation, feelings, thoughts. The source connects this back to that idea of the fall or the shattering we saw in Kabbalah. So the alchemical great work, just like the Kabbalistic one, is presented as an attempt to synthesize or reverse what got broken apart and individuated.
So across both these traditions, as presented by the source, the main goal is this synthesis of opposites: male, female, spirit, matter.
Absolutely. That really emerges as a core theme the source uses for its later interpretation. It's symbolized by figures like the rebus, the divine hermaphrodite, or even Baphomet in some contexts, figures representing the union of these divided principles.
And the source breaks down the roles. Mercury, or Mercurius, is chaos, water, primordial stuff.
Yeah, the female seeds, sometimes associated with snakes, nullity, kind of like Da'at or Chi in other systems. And sulfur is the opposite order, structure, organization, the male seed.
And their union creates the stone. Chaos and order coming together.
That's the idea presented, yeah, referencing scholars like Eliade. Their synthesis is the philosopher's stone.
Which is embodied in the rebus, this divine hermaphrodite figure, which keeps both the white color of mercury and the red of sulfur.
Mm-hmm. The source even points to cinnabar, that's mercury sulfide, right? A naturally occurring red and white rock as an Eastern alchemical analog. It notes that alchemy came to the Christian West partly through Islam.
And that in Islamic or Asiatic traditions, there's this strong desire to unite sacred and profane, material and spiritual.
Exactly, a drive to bridge the gap between man and God.
But here the source draws a really sharp contrast with Christianity, doesn't it?
It does, quite pointedly. It argues that, from the Christian perspective laid out in the source, Christ has already achieved this union of divine and material and made it accessible to believers.
So alchemy, trying to create another Christ in The Alchemist, is pointless.
Within that specific Christian framework represented, yes, it's seen as redundant, maybe even a misunderstanding or usurpation. The source suggests this alchemical goal really only makes sense if you believe there's this huge, unbridgeable gulf between the divine and the material that humans must bridge themselves, which it implies might be the case in Taoism or Islam from its perspective.
Okay, so we've got the framework, this belief in the spiritual mapping onto the physical, a critique of certain esoteric paths, and then using the internal logic of Kabbalah and alchemy, especially the great work, synthesis, microcosm, union of opposites. How does the source actually apply this lens? It turns to symbols, right?
That's the next step. The source puts forward the idea that meanings aren't always obvious, they need an interpreter. And if the physical maps to the spiritual, then nothing is really just a coincidence.
Even if the people involved have no idea.
Even then, according to this view. But the source immediately adds a caution.
Right? It warns against seeing signs everywhere, sort of like schizophrenia, it says. And it mentions interpretations it's moving away from, like that NASA Hebrew word example used to argue for a flat Earth.
Yeah, it's trying to signal it wants to use this lens in what it considers a more grounded way, even though the lens itself is esoteric. The stated approach for looking at Canada isn't about claiming, some secret group intended all this.
Or that there's a definite predetermined outcome.
Right. It's more about reading things as they are and seem to be progressing, but seen through this specific symbolic filter derived from alchemy and Kabbalah.
And that filter leads straight to the Canadian flag, which the source finds significant for multiple reasons.
It points immediately to the colors. The striking red on white. It acknowledges the historical links people usually talk about. England, Bourbon, France, the maple leaf itself representing resilience.
But the source makes a different connection using its esoteric lens.
An explicit connection. It says these colors, red on white, they just happen to align perfectly with the primary alchemical colors.
Red for sulfur, white for mercury.
Exactly. The red king and the white queen uniting in the rebus. Or, like we said, the mineral cinnabar. That visual resonance is key for the source's interpretation.
Okay, so let's apply that interpretive method the source talked about, looking at what something does or seems to be doing, not just its stated purpose. What does the source conclude about the maple leaf in Canada through this alchemical lens?
Well, looking at the maple leaf, seeing those alchemical colors, the source then makes the claim that Canada itself has subordinated its own traditions and identity in service to the ideology of solve et coagula.
Solve and coagula, the alchemical process. Dissolve and reintegrate.
That's the one. Dissolution and reintegration. The source sees Canada embodying this alchemical process on a national scale.
And the interpretation that comes out of this viewpoint is,
The source goes on to interpret Canada as a kind of new Tower of Babel. Yes, a place of refuge, but one where, in this view, all distinct identities are meant to be dissolved and then remade into one common secular identity.
an attempt to undo the scattering of nations.
That's how the source frames it, yes. Undoing what it describes as the stowering of the nations by God. It sees Canada as trying to be a type of the philosopher's stone itself, or maybe a new heavenly kingdom on earth.
Where all races, cultures, religions live together, united. A microcosm of the world, reflecting a great work achieved.
That's the aspiration it identifies. But the source immediately counters this. It states very clearly that, in its view, the great work has not been achieved, and never shall it be, by these means.
So this attempt at dissolving and reintegrating everyone is seen as
As a usurpation that cannot be achieved from this specific theological and esoteric standpoint. It's trying to do something that, in this view, only God can do, or has already done through Christ.
And how does this translate, according to the source, to the individual Canadian living within this system?
Ah, yes. The individual Canadian is described as being conceived of fundamentally as non-identitarian, represented by these universalizable symbols like the flag, perhaps.
And this non-identitarian individual is supported by a state with similar values.
That's the argument. A state that encourages and subsidizes their existence through universal programs, healthcare being one example mentioned.
And the source uses a very stark example to illustrate this point about the individual's perceived value.
It does. It brings up the Canadian state granting itself the right to allow medically assisted death, MAID. The interpretation offered by the source is that within this alchemical Canada framework it's describing, the individual is no longer primarily seen as
sacred.
or unique. Right. Not as a chalice for the divine or the end result of a unique lineage or carrier of specific culture, but merely as a Canadian, an interchangeable unit within this larger societal stone.
And the source claims this isn't just how the elites see Canadians, but it's a model they want to export globally.
That's the ultimate and very strong claim made in the source document, yes. It portrays this entire direction as aiming for nothing less than, and this is a direct quote again, the destruction of all culture, life, purpose, and ultimately the final death of God.
Wow. That is certainly a heavy interpretation to draw, all stemming from applying that specific esoteric lens.
It is. It's a very critical perspective. And it's worth noting the author explicitly states, despite reaching this conclusion, that they still love their country and heritage.
Which is interesting. It seems the source itself finds it surprising that the flag's colors could lead to such a poignant hermeneutic through this alchemical or esoteric reading.
Yeah, and it raises the idea that if everything does have a spiritual dimension, as the initial premise suggests, then the symbols that represent us, especially those used by people in power, could potentially have immense metaphysical influence.
Which leads to that provocative question the source asks near the end. When a politician looks at the Canadian flag and thinks about their allegiance,
what entity or force responds? That's the question posed. It's suggesting the symbol itself might connect to forces aligned with this alchemical interpretation, intentionally or not.
The author does add they don't think the maple leaf was intended to be diabolical.
No, but that modernity and perhaps the frameworks we've discussed make it hard from this specific viewpoint to see it any other way now.
And the source finishes with a kind of nuance, doesn't it? About coexisting realities.
It does. It suggests that this negative esoteric interpretation can exist at the same time as the reality of the Canadian nation persisting a nation the source views as maybe disenfranchised or under occupation forces, but still there, still holding on to a different, more favorable interpretation of itself.
So both things can be true at once in this view.
That's what the source seems to suggest. It even relates this duality back to the mercurial and sulfuric nature. It sees in modern Canada this blend of opposites it considers unnatural and expects to eventually fall away if, as it puts it, the foreign power is annulled.
It's definitely a complex and layered perspective we've explored today.
Very much so.
So to wrap up this deep dive, we've journeyed through one very specific source document, tracing its unique interpretive path. It applies these ancient esoteric concepts, alchemy, Kabbalah, to understand modern symbols and even the trajectory of a nation like Canada.
And just to reiterate, we've focused entirely on unpacking that particular complex viewpoint and the connections it draws, based strictly on the material provided. We haven't been endorsing it, just exploring its internal logic.
Right. And it certainly leaves us with some fascinating questions drawn directly from the source's themes for you to think about. How much power do symbols really hold? And who actually gets to decide what they mean? Who gets to be their interpreter?
Or maybe even, can multiple seemingly contradictory interpretations of something, whether it's a flag or a whole country, actually coexist and both be true in some sense at the same time? Lots to mull over there.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into this very unique perspective.